Welcome to the Angular Fundamentals course with me, Todd Motto. In this course, you're going to learn all the fundamentals that you need to build Angular applications with. But before we get started, what we're actually going to do is look at the high-level architecture of an Angular application, so you get a high-level understanding of what an Angular app looks like before we actually dive into some code. The typical architecture of an Angular application is made up of these 5 building blocks. So we have modules, components, directives, routing, and services. So what we'll do is walk through each of these one by one just to give you a high-level overview before we actually dive into writing some code, so you get a better understanding of an Angular application architecture before we dive in. Now, a module is a main building block of an application, so we can have multiple modules, we can have a single module, we can have modules that depend on other modules. So think of a module as a building block that can contain specific components, like a feature component, a service that ties in with that particular feature, and some routes to tell it which URL to go to in our application, such as /inbox. Now, if we look at this diagram, we can imagine an email client. So on the left, we have our chat, which you might have your inbox chat. In the center, we have an inbox, and at the top, we have a search. Now, each of these could be a module. So we could have a search module, a chat module, and an inbox module. So inside these modules, you can have specific components that are related to chat, specific components related to search, and so forth. So what is a component? A component contains a template, it contains the data and the logic, and it also forms part of a DOM tree. So when we're writing HTML to begin with, we're actually creating a DOM tree whether we know it or not. Now, a component is a higher level DOM tree node, which will then create subtree nodes. So this diagram here basically represents what our DOM tree of components will look like. And each component can then render its own HTML inside, but we call this approach a component architecture, which we'll look at further on in this course to actually use Angular to the fullest. A directive is something that we can bind to an existing DOM element or an HTML element or a component, or just use it inside a template on its own, which will extend or transform a particular element and its children. So you can see here that we have our component tree, however, we have an extra red box. The red box is indicating that we have a directive bound to this particular component, and this could be any component in any particular module. So let's assume that this is a search box and we've added a directive to then tie in some particular behavior when a user types. We might want to listen to an event. Angular also has a lot of built-in directives, so we'll be learning about these during the duration of this course. So a service is basically our data layer. All we've talked about so far are the particular components. Now, it's great having a component, but how do we actually get data into a component? So this is what we call a service. So if you imagine we want to make an AJAX request to our API, we want to fetch some data back, and then we pass it into a component. The component can then render that data, and we can make changes in the view, and we can update the back end, of which all of this logic will then lie in a service. So this is where we make things that are not component related, such as an API request, for example. Now you can see here in the next diagram, we also have in our component tree a service that we've assumed that is bound to a particular component. So this is giving you an idea of how a service can be tied to a particular component to give a specific component its data that it needs. Finally, we have routing. So all the routing is that it drives the navigation for our application. So it basically tells Angular which components to render based on the URL state. Now, if we head over to the next diagram, you can see that we have a purple component. Now, this is just a generic component, it's an ordinary component. However, we can assume at this point that we might want to change these two components that are child components based on the URL. So we might want to say, if we are at /inbox, we want to render the left-hand component. If we're at /settings, we're going to render the right-hand component. So this just signifies that this component can then have some kind of routing information bound to it, so we can render dynamic components. So now we've covered the Angular architecture at a higher level, let's get started with the project setup, installing the project, downloading the dependencies, and get writing some Angular code.